Miriam now for about 20 years. When I first took Abdullah in his freshman year to Duke University, that's what she used to teach. And we got to know her there, and he took his first Arabic class with her, and even a series of classes.
And he was very good as an actor.
And of course, I'm pleased that Abdullah is here today, with his former teacher. So happy to have Bruce Lawrence also, renowned professor in Islam and the Middle East, and he's here with us. He's also the husband of Miriam. Miriam was, and she's retired now from Duke, professor of other cultures. And she's been also visiting professor in many countries, including Tunisia, Romania, Indonesia, Qatar, as well as in Istanbul with the Alliance of Civilizations Institute. She's been also on several international advisory boards and academic journals as well as institutions. She's taught Arabic language in all levels for many, many years, as well as on Arabic literature, war and gender, Palestine-Israel conflict, post-colonial theory, and so on. Miriam is the author of many books, including The Anatomy of an Egyptian Intellectual, Ibn Haqqi, a well-known adib, well-known author. Wars, Other Voices, Women Writers in the Lebanese Civil War, Women and the War Story, Women Claim Islam, Creating Islamic Feminism Through Literature, Dissident Syria, and his latest book, I only read the first part, Dancing in Syria. So I said to my wife, Miriam just wrote something about dancing in Syria, and then I didn't see the rest of it, which is Creativity, Resilience, and the Syrian Revolution. So it was actually about what's going on now in Syria. I haven't read it. So she's also the editor of many volumes. Today she'll talk to us about Arab women writing about wars. So please welcome with me, Miriam.
Thank you very much, Professor Al Arian, and delighted also to have been invited by Fuad Zatari, who was also briefly a student of mine at the Alliance of Civilizations Institute. It's wonderful to be here. So happy to see your beautiful campus and to spend a little time here with you. So today I'm going to talk to you about Arab women combatants, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about what the word combatant means, and about the ways in which Arab women have been writing about women fighters. Now, this kind of question, so the gendering of war, would not have been a question 30 years ago. It was self-evident that war was something that men did, and peace was something that women did. So what happens when war is declared, and of course we're talking about a very different time now, but I would submit that the same kind of gendering, the same kind of binarizing of social spaces goes on until today, even though we don't have the kind of total war that has really shaped this war story. So when Dr. Al Arian mentioned the book that I wrote in 1996, Women and the War Story, when I talk about the war story as the frame within which the binarization of war and as an emotional experience, as a physical experience, is constructed. So why does it matter that combat has always been gendered? And it always has been, and even though today we have technological revolution in both the weaponry and in information, it remains gendered. You still think of men at the war front and women at the home front. We still think of war and peace as being opposite. And what I'm going to hopefully sketch out for you today is the continuum between these binaries. So why does it matter that combat has always been gendered? It matters because it allows for the most basic division to occur at the moment that war is declared. Men's space, the space of war, immediately then gets divided. Women's space, the space of peace, is somewhere else. And so again, when I talk about these basic binaries, this is in the imagination rather than in reality. So in these two gendered spaces, male, female, we have, of course, the front and the home, the defender, the men, the defendant, weak, needing to be defended, the women. Importantly, what we have in this unsafe space of war and the safe space of the home, we have the combatant and the civilian. Now, what matters and why feminist militarists have been really trying to deal with this binary, trying to deconstruct it, is that there is a huge stake in naming. It matters how you're named. It matters that if you are a combatant, and a combatant is someone who is named as someone who is prepared to kill and die for king and country, or queen and country, or president and country. And because you are a man, a combatant, ready to sacrifice yourself and to commit what would in peacetime be a crime, you are a citizen. This, of course, goes back to antiquity, doesn't it? I mean, who were the citizens in Plato's Police? The citizens were the few elite men, those who were prepared to kill and die for the ruler. So since these spaces are gendered, the ones who are being defended, who are in the safe space, are the civilians, are the non-combatants. That's the way they're named. Whether this is reality or not, whether this has ever been reality or not, is irrelevant, because as long as the naming works, then that has been the situation. That is why in America and in Europe, there has been so much mobilization on the part of women who are willing to become part of the military, to demand the right to be in combat. Because to be in combat is a basic, what would you say, passport to citizenship. So these binaries, of course, are patently untrue, and I would say this is true from antiquity. So Romulus, when he founded Rome, it was a city of men. That was how he was able to establish himself there, realizing that a city of just men would not survive beyond the lifespan of these men. He, of course, as we all know, authorized the rape of the Sabine women. So this was an enemy tribe. He told his men to invite the Sabine men and women to a banquet, and it was at the banquet that the women were abducted and raped. So here already, when we think about rape as a weapon of war, this goes back to certainly before Romulus. But I think it's always important to go back deep into history to understand what it is that's going on there. So what I'm going to argue for today is obviously a deconstruction of this binary, but also in light of what happened last week, so the Nobel Peace Prize to Nader Murad, to say that not only is rape a weapon of war, a weapon that destroys physical bodies, but that those who have been raped have been wounded. They have been wounded physically, psychologically, they have PTSD every bit as much as men under the bombs. And we're finally coming to the moment where it's being recognized that the wound of rape is equivalent to the wound of a bomb, to the wound of a gun, to the wound of an arrow. So, let me see if this is going to work. If we're going to now talk about the Arab world and the lie of women not having been combatants, we have right from the very beginning. So from the Battle of Badr, we have Nusayba bin Ka'b, who was fighting with Muhammad. The stereotype story is, okay, thank you. Don't look at it. So the story always was that the women who went with Muhammad or with the men during the Ayyam al-Arab were there as nurses. They were there to help, even to cheer the men on. That in fact this is not true, because we have here a woman whom history has recorded as having defended Muhammad. And so there are a couple of hadiths that in which Muhammad is said to have spoken to Nusayba's son and said, "Your mother, bind her wound, may Allah bless you, the people of a house. The stand of your mother is better than." And so he's praising her above the men who have fought with him. And in another hadith, whenever I looked to the right or the left, I saw her fighting in front of me. So Nusayba, of course, has been there throughout history, but pretty much erased from the ways in which we have thought about battles during this early period of Islam. And the way in which she has been recovered is as a result of what has been going on for the past 30 years or so, the Islamic feminist movement throughout Muslim countries, and even not Muslim countries, but conducted by men and women who are Islamic feminists. And beginning to look into history, to sift through dusty archives, to find the records of women who have had positions of power and who have actually fought with men. Now, of course, the very first mujahida that who has come down to us, I think, less as somebody who was fighting than somebody who was fighting rhetorically on behalf of her murdered brother, so Hussein. Of course, Zainab, the daughter of Fatima, and the granddaughter of the Prophet Muhammad. And of course, in the qarayat that are conducted all over the Shiite world, we have women mourning the death of Hussein, the murder of Hussein. But importantly, what Zainab has done in her defiance of the ruler Yazid is to create a role model for women participating in war and defying the ruler. This was something that, it goes on until today, but was particularly interesting in the case of Iraq under Saddam Hussein. So the Majalis al-Qiraya, as they're pronounced someplace, Majalis al-Qira'a, were places where Shiite women would gather, and in a very ritualistic way, and therefore it was difficult for the authorities to control them. They would go through the lamentation and go through actually citing the words of Zainab in her defiance of Yazid. And that was their defiance against Saddam Hussein. So we have her not only empowering women, but also venerated for her participation in war. Now, as I say, women's combat has been very much occluded over the centuries, over the millennia. And there has been, not only in the Arab world and in Islamic feminist studies, there has recently been a strong move on the part of feminists in America in particular, and in Europe, in Britain, looking at women who were working with, in the armaments, working with gunpowder, dying from lung disease because they had to deal with gunpowder, and who were eliminated from the story of the war. The fact that they were dying of lung disease because they were working with gunpowder did not qualify for combat. And so there have been arguments by many feminist scholars to say, no, we have to rethink not only the women in the armaments factories, we also have to think about ambulance drivers. They also have to be considered combatants. So coming back to the Arab world, Fatima Mernissi, the Moroccan sociologist, wrote a book called Sultan Oublié, so the Forgotten Queens of Islam. And among the many queens, so she has done an incredible work, as she did with everything, of finding and writing about these powerful women, these politically powerful women who actually were physically fighting or doing something within physical combat that needed to be renamed. And of course, one of them is Shajarat al-Dur, who a year after the Mongols sacked Baghdad, took over from her husband, who was leading the Egyptian army when he was killed. So an important figure in the Crusades. So, jumping over centuries, I will now turn to contemporary wars. So I'm going to be looking at pretty much the last 60 years of Arab women fighting in Arab wars, and the way in which their way of fighting has been named and has been renamed. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the Mujahidat of the War of Independence of Algerians from the French, 54 to 62. And of course the famous psychiatrist, Frantz Fanon, who had come from Martinique via Paris, while he was working with victims of torture, was watching the way in which women were negotiating the spaces of war. So again, I want just to remind you that what we're doing here is looking at the continuum between these two spaces and the way they're named. So the space of war and the space of peace. And he was so impressed with the way women negotiated the French Ville Nouvelle, were able to do what men could not do because of their woman's body, that he coined the term stratégie femme, which I use particularly in connection with the Palestinian situation, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And his description of stratégie femme then, of course, inspired Gino Pontecorvo to make the film Battle of Algiers in 1966. Who has seen the film? Good. I really, really recommend watching it. It's online. And though there is not a minute of actual footage, so it's a docudrama, it has done something very interesting. When Bruce and I were in Algiers and walking around the Kasbah, like 5 years ago, the Kasbah has become a museum to Pontecorvo's Battle of Algiers. So, okay, Battle of Algiers, does it matter? Yeah, it's an interesting film that turns the women absolutely into combatants. In fact, combatants better than the men, because the men could not negotiate those spaces. So if you look on the left, that Battle of Iraq, to many of our, to the amusement of many, the Pentagon decided that when the US military invaded and occupied Iraq, it was going to be very difficult for the men to negotiate the spaces of an Arab city. And so the Battle of Algiers became a military training film. It is true. So what happened after the war was over, the French had been kicked out, and there was still the awareness that women had participated. This did not last long, as I would say. There were two women, Jamila Bouhreid and Jamila Boupasha. And the French left became absolutely fascinated by these two women. Jamila Bouhreid spent time in prison. And Jamila Boupasha was then interviewed by Simone de Beauvoir and the Tunisian, whose name is out of my head, and they wrote a book about her. And in each case, when these Jamilas, and so Jamila now has become a term that many use for women who are involved in combat, it interviewed them. Oh my goodness, you were a heroine. Without you, you could not have done this. And their argument is was consistently, we are not heroines. We did what many, many, many women did. And the importance of this is something that all the feminist scholars understand, is that if one woman is exceptionalized, that erases the others. Because in exceptionalizing one woman, you're turning her really into a man. You know, you're as good as a man, so you're a heroine. And they rejected this. There's another one, her name is Zohra Drif. Her autobiography came out, I think about 5 years ago, just translated recently into English. Again, an absolute rejection of this exceptionalizing of women combatants. I did the same as the others. Now the problem in this, and in general, not acknowledging women as combatants, is that their participation can be erased very quickly. And there was a term that emerged out of the Algerian War, neo-traditionalism. In other words, okay, you women who were helpful during the war, now it's time for you to go home. In America, we call it the Rosie the Riveter syndrome. Rosie the Riveter, who put on men's overalls and worked in the armaments factories, but then when it was over, she was sent back home. So in America, if you say Rosie the Riveter, people know exactly what you're talking about. In Algeria, this is what happened also. To an extent that their participation was not only erased, but the women were so marginalized within this neo-traditional order that their voices disappeared. It took Assia Jabbar 23 years to finally bring out the first, it's actually the second volume, but a volume of her 3-part collective autobiography, in which she looks into women's resistance in Algeria from 1830. So from the moment that the French invaded Algiers in 1830 to 1962, in fact even further into the 70s, and she traces through the systematic erasure of women's resistance. In this novel, L'amour, la fantasia, translated into English as Fantasia, an Algerian cavalcade. And I call it a collective autobiography. So the I of Assia Jabbar is the I of the women whose participation she witnessed. She left before the war was over, but she witnessed these women's participation. She went into the Cabo Mountains, where a number of the participants, many of them Berber women, she herself is a Berber woman, and she decided that the only way that she could record these women with the truth of their voice was in film. In fact, it was during the 1970s that there was a movement in the newly decolonized parts of the world not to use the colonizer's language, to use the language of the country. And of course there was a problem, because an intellectual, elite intellectual, who had been brought up, trained in the language of the colonizers, so we of course have a Wathiongo in Kenya, speaking English, writing English, unable to write in Kikuyu. They say that there is no written language of Kikuyu. We know that this is not right. In Algeria, Berber said not to be written. The local Amiya, Darija, said not to be written. So how does an intellectual in a post-colonial moment, not post-colonial, post-independent moment, how does such a person write? If you can't write in the only language that you really know, because your mother tongue has been forbidden, how can you write? And so there emerged something called La Page Blanche, and that was the white page. I have to write, I can't write. And so what Jabbar did was like Othiongo, and that was to say, I can use the words of the people, and I can do this in theater, which is what Othiongo did, or I can do it in film. So what she did is she went into the mountains and she made a film. And again, these are available online, but very, very poor versions, but you'll find it interesting. interviewing these women who had been combatants. They were the ones that she was working with. And they told her their stories. What she then did, she was a historian as well, she then went into the archives, the French archives, in both France and in Algiers, and she read the French men's memoirs and chronicles of the 1830 to 1900 period, with all of their descriptions of, sorry, I'm being distracted, with all of their
So there is no air, so I want to open.
Oh, great.
Or otherwise we can open, but
Yes, please do. No, please
there is
do.
no air, I cannot concentrate.
Well, then let's open.
Okay. Okay.
Can I?
نفتح الشبابيك.
Yes.
Sorry for interrupting.
No, it's good. I was getting nervous, y'all. I thought it was me.
Even if you open the door.
I'm very sensitive regarding the
How
atmosphere, how
Yes.
weather.
Yes, exactly. So what she did was she combined her research in the French chronicles with her own experience, with the experience of the women whom she interviewed and came out in La Nouvelle des Femmes du Monde Chinois is the name of the film. And what she did is she started to weave together these stories. When she looked at the men's chronicles, there was not a word about women. When she looked at the ways in which the FLN were writing about women in the Battle of Algiers, in the War of Independence, she didn't find their voices. So she's like, mashallah, it's the same story. And she then conducted, this is an incredible novel of subaltern studies theory. Are you all familiar with subaltern studies? I'll say a word about it. This is a theoretical school that emerged out of Calcutta, so a Bengali school of social history, under the leadership of a man called Ranajit Guha. And Ranajit Guha, who was a Marxist historian of the British occupation of India, was very curious about the way in which the British were writing about the history of Bengal in the 19th century. And it was very strange because they would write, on Tuesday we did this, and then on Thursday, and then on Friday and Saturday, let's say 1817, and then in 1850, so 1817 every single day, and it's a recording of their victories. And then in 1850 or whenever, there they are again, and they've got some more victories. And he's like, well, what's in the gap? I need to find out. So he went to the courts, and he looked through the archives of the courts, and what he found in the archives were peasant revolts. And so whenever the peasants were successful in keeping the British out, that did not enter into the British archives. It didn't enter into British historiography.
It's a different narrative.
It's an entirely different narrative, and you find it between the lines of history. So subaltern historiography is between the lines of history. So you can imagine it as in black, you have the French Chronicle of 1830 to 1954, and between the lines, let's say in green or blue, whatever color you like, we have the erased history, the subaltern history. It's not erasing the official history. It is what we need to understand to make sense of official history and to write back into history those who have been erased. This is what she does. So she writes out of a world of silence. And the theme of the book is l'écrit and l'écrit. Sounds the same. So if you know French, you might be more sensitive to it. L'écrit is what is written. L'écrit are the cries. So it's what happens between the cries, the sounds of women, and she sometimes talks about Zararid, and what happens when you write. And bringing them together, the way they try to erase each other and the way in which they embrace each other. And so that's why I call this a collective autobiography. So now moving to Palestine, and what is so important here is that, in my understanding, and particularly when I have spoken to Palestinian women writers, is that it is here that we begin to see what I have called the learning of the Algerian lesson. So many people refer to the Algerian lesson as women who do not claim their participation at the time of participating are in danger of losing their voices. And so what people like Assia Jabbar were saying about Algeria is we should have spoken. I can now retrieve these voices, but I should have written earlier. And so, I'm sure you all know, when the War of Independence was won, I think it was Ben Bella who said, the war, our revolution will not have succeeded in Algeria until the Palestinian revolution succeeds. And so, I think the connection between the War of Independence in Algeria and the Palestinian revolution, particularly from '67, is, for me, is very tight. So as you know, after the war of 1967, the occupation of the Darfur, of the West Bank, we have what I refer to, and I've written about this in my book, Women in the War Story, that Dr. Al Arian mentioned, is what I call the Women's Intifada. And I call it the Women's Intifada because of the tactics of women in the streets, of the combatants in the streets, were then picked up in 1987, but organized and centralized. And I say that the Women's Intifada begins in 1967 because, and I'll talk about this in a minute, writers like Sahar Khalifa and Fadwa Tuqan, who comes from the famous, many of you I'm sure have heard of her, or of the family, this very famous intellectual family, also from Nablus, were writing right from the beginning. So Fadwa Tuqan wrote a poem called As-Sayrura, Becoming. It's quite a short poem. It came out in 1969. And it is a poem about Rashaq al-Hajar. So already in 1969, the idea of children throwing stones as an effective way of keeping Israeli tanks and soldiers out of neighborhoods had already started. And of course, what was the importance of this? How were women able, as in this image, to speak truth to power? How can an unarmed woman talk to an Israeli soldier who has been trained? Look at him, his face is, he's got a mask, he's wearing bulletproof vest, and he can't do anything. Why not? So Edward Said, in The Question of Palestine, explains something the book came out after the end of what I call the men's Intifada, came out a year later. But of course he makes an interesting point again and again, that as long as the media, the world media, was looking at unarmed children and unarmed women, yelling, confronting soldiers, look at her here, confronting these soldiers, and they're always so armed. They've got helmets and their bulletproof vests. His argument was the role of international media. So the person who has written for me the most persuasively about, and this is going back to France Fanon, is Sahar Khalifa from Nablus, and she has like a three-part series of novels, Subar in 1974, and this was written from the late 60s, in which you have vivid descriptions of, again, Rushab al-Hajar, the children throwing the stones, the mothers in the streets, the burning of tires, and that being effective, that keeping the tanks out of the streets, and above all, the women not allowing young men between the ages of 18 and 30 or 35 from going into the streets. Anything that looked like a possible combatant in the binarized meaning of the term would then open the possibility for soldiers trained to fight in a particular way to fight back. In Asubar, what translated, God knows why, wild thorns, but still it should be prickly pear, but still. The way that the two main characters fight against the Israeli, who's read Asubar? Just one. Was that with me?
Yeah, and I teach it now.
Okay. Oh, you teach it? Great. So here you have two of the main characters. One has come back from Kuwait, where he's been preparing to fight as a fidai, and his cousin, who has stayed in the West Bank and is working with the Israelis. Not with, for, but working for the Israelis, because there are no options for work in the West Bank. And so the novel is about the confrontation between these two men. How do you fight the Israelis? Do you fight them with arms? Osama is killed in his directed fight against the Israelis. The Israelis kill him, and then his cousin has already lost, because the only way he can survive is by becoming, in some ways, complicit with the Israeli system. Meanwhile, in Asubar, the women are in the background, but they're sort of saying, look guys, this isn't the way to fight. In Abad al-Shams, which came out 6 years later, we move from men's ways of fighting and their unsuccessful ways of fighting to women's ways of fighting. So Stratégie Femme in Abad al-Shams, in Sunflowers, which I think has not been translated yet. And here, the very short descriptions that you find in Asubar of the way of women in the streets with the children, with the tanks unable to roll through neighborhoods, you have this elaborated in Abad al-Shams. And then finally, in Bab al-Salha, came out in 1990, that Sahar Khalifa had been writing during what I call the men's Intifada, so from 87, at a time when she had opened up her apartment. She was teaching at Najaf University in Nablus. she opened up her apartment and during curfew, had the students come and work with her. But interestingly enough, one of her most important courses was tactics, combat tactics. So she was getting the students, male and female students, to teach each other tactics of street fighting. And in Bab al-Saha, anyone read it? Oh, you must. So I'm here as an advocate for Sahara Khalifa. She writes about a young woman who, with her lover, has been involved in a ishtibak. There was some fighting. The Palestinians were rounded up by the Israelis and thrown into jail. So when this woman comes out of jail, the assumption is that she was raped by the Israelis, and therefore that she must be a prostitute. And so her house is shunned until a young man is wounded, brought into her house, and the two of them watch the way in which the young men are trying to enter into a military headquarters in Bab al-Saha. It's actually called Bab al-Saha. And so this young woman watches the young men climbing up the wall, and each time, of course, that their head comes up, they're shot. And she's like, no, I mean, this is not the way. You cannot fight the Israelis like this. Look, come into my house that has been haram. Nobody has been going into it because of who she is named to be. And she says, look, if you come downstairs through my kitchen, notice the domestic symbol. If you come down through my kitchen, there is a secret passageway that comes up in the middle of the maqar, of the military headquarters. So she gets all the young men to follow her, and she comes up in the middle with a Molotov cocktail. And that's the end. You know, is she shot or is it suicide? It's not clear. But what is clear, that women's ways of fighting, even during the men's Intifada, are most effective. One thing that I think we can learn from Sahara Khalifa is a term that I'm sure some of you are familiar with, is sumud. So that is steadfastness, the importance of staying. And so that, of course, was a critique already in Nasubah, in Wild Thorns. Look, when you go to Kuwait, that's not the way to fight. This is all, of course, in that earlier period. And her important contribution, and there's another book that came out about 18 years ago, 15, Al-Mirath. Anyone read Al-Mirath? The Inheritance, in which she, again, this is not part of her Intifada trilogy, but she again talks about the social revolution, the feminist women's revolution, and saying no to critique the way men fight. My men, my Palestinian brothers, fathers, sons fight. To critique them is not to be a traitor, is not to be accused of cultural betrayal. It is a necessary part of the political revolution. The social and the political revolutions cannot win alone. So that if you win the political revolution, in other words, against Israeli occupation, it's the social revolution. If you have not altered the class, gender structure of society, then the political revolution will not succeed. So since I think we're beginning to run out of time, I'll go quite quickly through the various other wars. in a book that I published in 1987 called Boys' Other Stories, I looked at the many, many, many works of literature that Lebanese women wrote. I had been told there were no women who were writing in Lebanon during the war, right? So we don't just erase the way women fight, but we erase what they write. During my time there between 1980 and 1982, I found over 50 women's, not just 50 books, but 50 women who had written about the Lebanese Civil War, the Harb Ahliya in Lebanon. And I just show you here one because it's the best known, the story Hikayat Zahra that came out in 1980, story of a woman who thinks that she can use war for peace, and she fails. And what I found in all of these writings was the emerging understanding on the part of these Lebanese women, most of whom had stayed during most of the war, and Hanan Sheikh did not. She left during the war. Was that those who stayed, and it somehow was, they could stay because if you left and your apartment or your house was empty, then the refugees from the south might take over the apartment because there was nobody there. Or some of the Musalahin might take over the apartment. So women were staying to hold on to the property. And so in the beginning it made sense because the men would go either to the Khalij or they would go to Europe to make money. They were sending money back to Beirut throughout the time. And so the more time passed, so you see the war lasted for 15 years. The longer they stayed, the more that they were exposed to violence, the more they began to think about their staying as passive, as active survival. And the longer they thought of themselves as surviving war, surviving violence, the more they started to think of themselves as combatants. And of course, as combatants, they were beginning to earn the right to be citizens. So I hope you're seeing the way in which naming is so important. So after Taif, in Lebanon, 1989, the agreement, the war ended without provisions for justice. And I think this is something that is so crucial to think about the crisis now. It's what you can call the crisis of amnesty. Sort of everybody is forgiven, yalla, let's forget about it, and let's just get on with life. And so, amnesty, amnesia, nicely paired. Of course, let's just forget about the war. And of course, what happens then is you have PTSD, right? You have a kind of national post-traumatic stress disorder. And this you can read in Najwa Barakat's Yes Salim, a very frightening, terrible novel that came out in 1999. And it's all about how people going through daily life, you know, we're in this room, and I don't know if you were a torturer, if you were a sniper, if you were a mother who lost her child, if the next one next to you was an explosives expert. So in this world where perpetrators are walking around freely, how does one function as somebody who wasn't a perpetrator, but also how do you function as a perpetrator? And this is the subject of Yes Salim. And that is, we have one explosive expert and a sniper and a torturer who all are terrified of peace. So what is this peace? Of course, it's war by any other name. what did Clausewitz call it? Politics is war by another name or something, by other means. War is politics by other means, yeah. So you have, they're crazy. They should be, one is, but they should all be in psychiatric hospitals, because the only way that they can live and breathe is to try and remember the great men they were during the war. So, a terrible situation. So, moving to the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, we have a woman called Riverbend. It is her pseudonym. She does not want to be known. Writing at times a daily blog of the impact of the US invasion on her in Baghdad, on her life, on everybody's life in Baghdad. So I call them dispatches from the front. And here in idiomatic English, American English, she writes an extraordinary chronicle of the first months of the invasion. And what is so interesting is that, of course, the blog is an entirely different form of writing. You start to engage with your readers. And some of her readers, with time, are Americans, English people, who are, they're not Iraqi. No Iraqi writes English like that, and she writes back. Just goes to show how little you know about us Iraqis. And so then she starts to not only adopt the responsibility of informing the world about what's going on, about the crimes of the Americans there, about her sympathy for the American soldiers, because she looks at them and she says, oh my God, you know, they're 18 years old, they're absolutely terrified. Every time they hear somebody cough, they think it's a bomb. So she's between sympathy for these guys, loathing for them, and of course, loathing for the puppets. So these are the Iraqis that the Americans have put into positions of power. So that's one level of responsibility. The other is her responsibility to inform the world about what Iraq was, about the status of women, the most highly, she says, the most highly educated women in the Arab world. She says, I was an IT expert, which is why, of course, she can do this blogging so well. What's happened, and now she's critiquing the Shiite regime, because she says, I used to go out in short skirts, in jeans, with my hair uncovered, and now I'm not allowed to go out except totally covered. Her name is Riverbend. That's the name she uses, Riverbend. Okay, moving right along, we're almost there. So, of course, Rabi' al-Arabi and in Tahrir, and a woman as is she Aisha on the camel, calling the men to battle. So Asma Mahfouz on January, I think, 24th, using Skype and Facebook to call all Cairenes and indeed all Egyptians to demonstrate, and saying, for those of you who knows Asma Mahfouz? No, not really. I'm just to know the name. Actually, not of course. Only 4 people. Yeah. So telling and talking to the men, right? Not speaking like Zainab to Yazid, so not speaking to Mubarak, but speaking to the men and saying, you have to go because this regime is unjust. And if you don't go, you're not men. She's not saying that you're women. She's saying you're just not men. The novel that was written about this period by Noella Saadawi, who's heard of her? Okay, and I see you frowning. I knew some people would frown, but that's okay. Nawala Saadawi wrote a book called Intifada, it's blood. It's not translated into English. And it's a novel that emerges out of her own experience of the revolution. And interestingly enough, we were talking with Abdallah earlier about the transformation in the young Ikhwan Muslimin. Young Ikhwan men consulting with her, and of course the older generation had put her onto the death list, which is why she was in our university, so Abdallah versus my university, Duke, for 4 years. But then daily, young men would come on their motorbikes to her apartment in somewhere. It's actually way up the Nile. And they would put her on the back of the motorbike, and she has funny stories that this is a story she told me, not in Ahudam, where there would be the driver, and then she's quite a big woman. She'd sit behind the driver, and then somebody would sit behind her to make sure she didn't fall off. And so she tells the stories of Tahrir in Ahudam. Of course, the Syrian Revolution that burst out in March of the same year, so 2011, and Samar Yazbek, an Alawite woman who has been consistently against the Alawite regime. So again, this notion that, if you're an Alawite, therefore you must be with the Assad regime, absolutely not. And in this, anyone read this book? Again, I'd highly recommend it. Her struggle not only against the Alawite regime, but also against all of the Sunni and Shia and everybody who thought that as an Alawite she must be part of the regime, because she also comes from an elite family. And the way in which she would go into danger zones, because she felt, again, this urgency that I've been talking about on the part of Arab women writers to talk about Arab women's participation in the revolution that until today, those who were part of it in the beginning refused to call it a civil war. They called it a revolution until today. And when you think about the French Revolution, the first years of the revolution were called, do you know what? The Reign of Terror. It was a reign of terror. And it took 80 years for the revolution really to be understood as a revolution. In other words, a social revolution that transforms the country, the political and the social working together. Extraordinary story. Okay, so let's not end on a negative note. Let's not end on absolute violence, but let's think about the women's victories. And I'm going to talk about the two women who in the last 7 years, from the Arab world, who have gotten peace prizes. So in 2011, we have Tawakkul Karman from Yemen, who was one of the leaders of the revolution against President Saleh, who in her acceptance speech says, "I've always believed that resistance against repression and violence is possible, without relying on similar repression and violence." Listen to the language of Stratégie Femme, right? Not violence. What we have to do is we have to find a way of understanding violence and repression, and understanding how we can disarm. The solution to women's issues can only be achieved in a free and democratic society in which human energy is liberated. And now listen to this, the energy of both women and men together. So the binarization of women and men has to be broken. War and peace has to be broken. We have to understand the mechanisms that allow for this binary to continue and to allow for the continuation of violence. And of course, I close with last week's extraordinary announcement of Nadia Murad's awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize. Have you all heard of her? Good. It's only been a week, so. So of course you probably know a little bit about the story. So Daesh, the Islamic State, captured about 5,000 women and children from Jabal Sinjar, the Yazidi mountain in the north of Iraq, put them into rape camps like the Bosnian women in the ex-Yugoslavia, who had been put into sexual slavery by the Serbs. And we have here the story of a rape survivor silenced throughout history, because how can a rape survivor go back into society, particularly patriarchal society, and most of the world except for, I think there's a little area in Indonesia that's matriarchal, and I'm told there are villages that are matriarchal somewhere in Turkey. But generally, we live in patriarchy. And the idea that a woman has been violently abused, sexually abused, is very difficult for communities to accept. And so there's been this stigmatization of rape survivors. So she is the outcome, and I'm writing about this now, the outcome of what happened to the Korean women, comfort women, in 1991, where they went to the UN and they said, we were sexually abused, we demand justice, we demand an apology from the Japanese. They didn't get what they wanted, but it was the first time that one really began to hear from women whose faces were allowed to be seen. Now, what happens to Nadia Murad in her book, that came out in November, The Last Girl, My Story of Captivity and My Fight Against the Islamic State, is that she escaped in 2015, came back to Iraq, because she was, of course, in Raqqa, in Syria, and found that her Yazidi community in the refugee camps was, they were stigmatizing the rape survivors. Gosh, I'm really sorry, I know you've been through a tough time, but you are kind of spoiled goods. She then works there with the women who have come back from a similar experience that she's had, and she says, you're not ruined. And in her work, she, suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, working with other women, is then interviewed by some foreign journalists. They say, would you come with us to Britain? And are you willing to tell your story, even though you know that your community has stigmatized you, and probably the world has, because my goodness, how could it not be stigmatized for this physical abuse to your body? And she goes, yeah. And she's shocked that she says yes, because she knows that she's going to have to talk in detail. So she then, in 2016, she's named the UN Goodwill Ambassador for Dignity of Survivors of Human Trafficking. trafficking, so human trafficking, so selling and buying women and children for sex. So this Goodwill Ambassador for Dignity of Survivors of Human Trafficking had never ever before been given to a survivor. So it's all about the survivors, but never to an actual survivor. And of course, it's because there was so much shame involved in it. And so what we have over the past 2 years, which of course has led to this extraordinary news of last week, is that this first rape survivor to be internationally acclaimed is now speaking for all the other rape survivors. And we have to remember that it isn't just women who are raped in war, but it's men also. And what she's speaking for them. She's speaking for her. She's speaking for herself. She's speaking for the women that she knows. She's speaking in the bigger circle for the Yazidi community. She's speaking for all rape survivors, and she's giving them all a voice. So, in ending my not always very uplifting presentation today, I end on a hope of note, a note of hope. You see, I can't even speak English anymore. On a note of hope that we are seeing perhaps something new. And the way she ends, the reason she calls her book The Last Girl is that she hopes that she's the last girl to have she said, I hope I am the last girl to have a story like mine.
Thank you very much, Professor Cooke, for this really enlightening presentation. I really enjoyed it very much. It opened our eyes to many struggles that generally overlooked the role of women in this. I myself grew up in the 60s, I was very young, but in the 80s I was an adult and I saw the participation of women in the first Intifada. And it wasn't meant to Intifada women, but there was also participation of women in many aspects, I believe. You mentioned many of the other struggles that have taken place within Syria, Yemen, and other places. So I do have a question that I will reserve to the end, and because of the time, I will take 3, and then maybe you can answer together. So, all right. The floor is open. If anybody has any questions, I would like to. I suspect Imad from Algeria may have something to say. My question actually has to do with how do you compare the struggle in the Arab world with the struggle of women in America, for instance? Are there any similarities or differences? And what lessons can we learn from that struggle?
So if you're talking about women's demand to be included in military combat?
All the way from Susan B. Anthony.
Oh, so you're talking about the feminist struggle in general,
Not
for
just feminist,
suffrage?
but yes, I mean that's part of it, but
Yeah.
overall, we hear today's Me Too movement and everything else that's going on, and many struggles and many achievements and sometimes setbacks. And of course, you've been a close observer of what's happening in our area, at least. Do you see any comparisons? Can you make any projections?
Okay, yeah. So we're really blurring, the binary when we talk about the feminist struggle from, as you say, Wollstonecraft, so the beginning of the 19th century in America, the suffragists in England beginning before World War I and then continuing afterwards. So we have the feminist struggle, which is for women's rights, and you can certainly call it a kind of war. I was a little careful not to do that, and the reason that I don't want to do it is that I think it's important to the naming again. So for me, it's very important that the combat that I'm talking about is in the space of war that is men's space, the feminist struggle for rights, for voting, for suffrage, for inheritance, women in the West, whatever that is, Europe and America, they didn't have rights to inheritance that Muslim women had from the 7th century. They didn't have until the 19th century. So they were demanding rights that Muslim women had from the 7th century. So that's a particular kind of struggle, and I think I would compare that more with women's demands for rights like Huda Sha'rawi, even, you know, Abdallah knows best, a woman like Zainab al-Ghazali, who wrote her prison memoirs as a kind of what I call a feminist manual. So Ayam al-Hayati, demanding her rights as a Muslim woman, but in the time of jihad. So there I begin to blur a bit war with jihad. Jihad al-Asghar, really. So in other words, the war against the Nasser, the war against people who are against Muslims. But if I am to compare more with what I was trying to talk about today, I would compare with women's mobilization in Europe and in America for rights to be included fully as combatants. So here we're in the question of combat again.
So basically, you're arguing for this? Or do you need to be
I did for a while. I'm not sure I do anymore. But yes, they're called feminist militarists. And I was until Bruce and I went to I keep on wanting to say Crimea. No, next to Bosnia.
The party is the other place.
Croatia, thank you so much. Yeah, so we spent some time in Croatia in some Bosnian camps. Yeah. And I ceased to be a pacifist at that point. But the argument of militarist feminists, so these are women who are demanding rights for women that, as I was saying earlier, are rights to be called a citizen, because you are prepared to die and kill for your nation, your country, your ruler. And so recognition on the part of militarist feminists that if what you're doing, which could be, and there was one feminist theorist who talked about the fact that there were women during World War II who would load World War I, who would load the cannon, do all the work, putting in the cannonballs, and then they'd step back and the man would press the button, and off would go the cannonball, the men were the combatants and the women were not. And she's written an entire book on this. So it's all about men. You know, the women who are carrying the big cannonballs and putting them into the cannon are doing work that in some ways is more difficult than the guy who's pulling the string or pressing the button. So that is a demand. It's a feminist demand for women to be considered citizens. In America, the demand for women to be included in combat, you may not have forgotten the year, but I think it was something like, it was under Clinton. Clinton was the first.
It was 1990. It was in 1990. When he was
yes.
the chairman of Joint Chiefs. Yes.
So it's 1990s for America, for the American military, for the Pentagon, to finally allow a few very specialized women to fly combat jets, for example. And so that's a very narrowly defined idea of combat. The other is the more pacifist demand for women to be considered combatants. Is that if women come into the military, and that's what a number of us who were working from a more pacifist point of view, was that if you bring women into the military because of their, what Sarah Ruddick refers to as their maternal thinking, well, it's actually the name of her book. It's the title of her book, which emerges out of a stereotype, but actually is not. It's interesting. So women who think like, people who think like mothers are going to naturally fight for peace. And when she talks about maternal thinking, it is to think like a mother. Now you can be a man who thinks like a mother. All that matters is that the person in your care, the nation in your care, is protected by you the way that a mother, the way that, like, a mother protects her child. And so if we have the military full of people who think like mothers, it'll be the end of war. Well, that wasn't quite right.
No, I'm sorry, because we have the president will be waiting for us for lunch, so we're get here 12:30. So we got some time. Oh, we got time. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Today I want to meet with you. I'm from Anadolu News Agency. I'm a journalist. And
yes, okay, you told me.
My name is Elif, and your presentation, actually, your enlightening presentation, reminds me of Halit Husseini's A Thousand Splendid Sun. You know.
Yes. The one who did the kite runner.
Yeah. He is the man, but he's the voice of the women in the Afghanistan, especially. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. And it is very important that you mentioned many times about Bosnia and the conflict in Bosnia, because I lived 4 years in Sarajevo, and many times I did interview with the mothers of Srebrenica, you know, because in one night approximately 8,000 men slaughtered.
The 11th of September.
Yes,
1991.
Sorry, not September, July.
But every 11th of the month, the women.
Yeah, they are
like the women of the life.
Yeah, and they are putting this,
photograph.
Yeah. And my question is, beginning of the 20th century, we witnessed this kind of war, and unfortunately, brutal war. So now Syria, Iraq. So why is the history repeating itself again, always?
What did Marx say? In history, repeats itself. The first time in tragedy, and the next in comedy.
In Bosnia and in Afghanistan, you shed light.
Farce. Sorry, when history repeats itself, it returns as farce.
Yeah. Now, getting worse. Why?
Try to make that short answer because it's really important.
Oh, yes. Technology.
Because of
No, I think it's a problem because we have the technologization of weaponry and of information, and I think particularly problematic are things like Facebook. Professor Arian knows much better than I, but I also have been somewhat in this situation. If you're being attacked and it's online, people, it's like, do you know the word lynching? So, like in America, when black people were hung from trees, and that it's a group mentality. But we have cyber lynching, and where each person who posts to a site that is criticizing you, each person has to be more disgusting than the one before, and so you have the emergence of death threats that just started with somebody saying, I don't like this article, I don't like this interview. So it happened to me. It was an interview, and then it went viral, and by the end, they wanted to cut me to pieces. It was just because cyber lynching.
All right, thank you so much for this. To present you.
Oh, thank you.
This is basically.
Oh my goodness, it's gorgeous. Thank you. Wow. Thank you. Wow, it's gorgeous.
Here you go. We can send you what we have.
Okay, great.
All right, we're going to London now.
Yes, it needs its box. Oh, thank you. What a wonderful reminder. Thank you.